Hello, I wanted to let you know before I start this podcast episode that I have a sale going on. I was originally going to have my course on sale till the end of May, decided to extend that to my birthday, which is June 12th. So you can get my online course, Know Your Ancestor, for $100 off until June 12th at midnight. Okay, so that puts the price at $200 if you pay for it in full, or $35 a month for 6 months. You get access to monthly Q&As for 6 months. You get instant access to the online course that you can go in and learn how to research and discover information in the records about your ancestors, to really learn who they were, to learn what experience they had, what trauma they might have had, and to ask the questions that help you to understand how their lives might be affecting you today. It's a really powerful course. So if you want that course, if you're ready to really dive in and get that, you can start it at any time. If you're like, summer is too busy, I want to wait for fall, you can purchase it. You have lifetime access. If you want to hold off on those 6 months of Q&As, just let me know and I will hold that off for you. So you can go and get the course at knowyourancestorcourse.com, and it is on sale. So go take advantage of that until June 12th at midnight. Hello and welcome to the podcast today. I want to talk a bit more about epigenetics today. So it's kind of a fascinating concept, and especially as it applies to genealogy and like learning the stories of our actual ancestors. And so I want to talk today about discovering your own generational trauma and how you can do that by answering 3 questions. Okay, but before we get into that, I want to talk a little bit about a video that I shared on Instagram a few days ago. So I shared this video about my great grandmother. I kind of summarized her life in like 2 minutes, a little video about her life. And I shared it that it is part of my online course, Know Your Ancestors, that at the end of the course, you can share your ancestor story, make their story into a little video to share with your family. And I just wanted to share that there's more to it than that. So in the online course, yes, we learn your ancestor story, but we also learn about their experiences and consider these 3 questions that I'm going to share with you today about how to discover your own generational trauma and what it means for you. So with that, I'm going to get started asking you these 3 questions. We'll go through each of the 3 questions, and I'm going to share my own great-grandmother, the things about her life that might give me some insight into what generational trauma I might have from her. Okay, before we get into that, I'm going to share some information from some articles, some academic articles about epigenetics. There's lots of studies going on right now. You've probably heard of, well, I've shared here before about the study with the rats and the getting shocked and then smelling a certain scent, and then their descendants also having this apprehension once they smell the scent to be scared of getting a shock, even though they weren't getting a shock. Anyway, so there's lots of studies going on. They are trying to discover things with humans. As you can assume, like there's so many variables with humans' lives. We're not going to create an experiment that, instigates these traumatic events on humans and watching their children and posterity over time, right? So we have to look at just things that have happened, the Holocaust or Romanian orphans, things like that that are already happening, and then study the offspring to see if there's any patterns. We can't keep all the variables like isolated, right? As a scientist, you know that you have to, there's a protocol for a correct experiment, right? And so some of these things can't be said for certain that it happens in humans, but looking at some of the patterns and things that they found in studies of like Holocaust descendants or things like that, there is some things going on. And just how we are discovering how DNA works, how the transmission of DNA and genetics and epigenetics, how that all works. It seems to stand to reason that this happens in humans just as it does in those rats being shocked and smelling the cherry blossom smell. So I just want to read a little summary of what this concept is. So it says on the simplest, this is from an article that I'll also link from, let me see who, Yehuda. Rachel Yehuda is the one who wrote it, Intergenerational Transmission of Trauma Effects. Anyways, this was in 2018. So there's been some development since then. This is kind of just presenting the hypothesis, the idea that this might be something to look into. It says on the simplest level, the concept of intergenerational trauma acknowledges that exposure to extremely adverse events impacts individuals to such a great extent that their offspring find themselves grappling with their parents' post-traumatic state. A more recent and provocative claim is that the experience of trauma, or more accurately, the effect of that experience, is passed somehow from one generation to the next through non-genomic, possibly epigenetic mechanisms affecting DNA function or gene transcription. So they're finding evidence of both intergenerational, so that's from like a parent to child transmission, and transgenerational, which is like from a parent to their grandchild or possibly even great-grandchild. Okay, so there's studies going on. People are trying to find information about that. So there's also a lot of information about the effect of being in your utero while something is happening to your parent. Well, with how female biology works, here's this images from this article here that was written in 2023. There's an environmental influence, say smoking. How does that affect the first generation, the person who's doing the smoking? How does that affect the child that's in the womb? And then within that child that's in the womb, there is a third generation. The eggs of the mother are already in her when she is in her mother's womb. Okay, so the environmental influence of your grandmother could have affected you epigenetically. Okay, for males, the environmental influence affects that first generation and then the second generation, their child. Okay, so after looking at that diagram, we can think, well, number one, what was happening to my grandmother at the time that she was pregnant with my mother? Or also just before they were pregnant, there's findings that even just before they conceived, sometime before, those patterns, those epigenetic changes have already happened. Are they being passed on? So with that kind of quick understanding of what epigenetics is and how we can apply that to genealogy, learning about what actually happened to our ancestors, this generational trauma is not just a theory. It's not just thinking, oh, well, our ancestors had it hard, women were not seen as, real people. That was hard for them. We can actually look at what things happened to them and how might those things have affected them and their posterity. So with my great-grandmother, I used her as an example as I created my online course, Know Your Ancestor. And through those worksheets and the information that we go through in that course, we ask these kind of questions. So the first question is, what life-changing or traumatic experience did my ancestors have before my ancestral line was born? Okay, so we can look at when we choose one ancestor, we look, okay, what happened to them before their child that I descend from was born, right? Because we're not going to be affected genetically after that child was born, right? We might be affected, environmentally or, how they parented our grandparent or our whoever we descend from, right? But we're not going to be affected genetically after they're born. That's just not possible, right? So that's the first question. Okay, so for my great-grandmother, I took a look at what things happened in her life that would be considered traumatic or life altering, right? So first of all, she had some siblings die. So when she was 5 years old, we have a biography of her. So that's how I have this information. Not everyone is going to have this information. But when you look at death records of maybe the siblings of your ancestors and you can see the cause of death, how old they are, you can kind of start to build what story might have happened to them. Okay, so my great grandmother's brother, Charles, he was born in 1890. She was born in 1886. In 1891, the following year, when he was about 1 years old, he was actually almost 1 years old. It says he was a toddler when on wash day he fell into a tub of scalding water. His agony was probably only exceeded by that of his mother when he died on January 26th, 1891. And then 1 year later, on January 15th, 1892, their sixth son, Tracy, was born but only lived 1 week, dying January 23rd, 1892. Only someone who has had such losses can really feel the grief and sadness that this dear mother must have endured. Okay, so this is from a biography that someone wrote about Mary's mother, right? So then we can think, okay, this is what happened to the mother, had these two children that passed away. What about the siblings that were there? So Mary was 5 years old, almost 5 years old, when her brother Charles died quite traumatically. How might that have affected her? Okay, so first we're getting these instances, these traumatic events that happened in her life. Okay, so we have that she had two siblings that died. One, a few days after birth as a baby, she would have been almost 6 years old at that time, and then when she was almost 5, her younger brother died at about 1 years old, falling into scalding hot water. Okay, so those are two events that happened to her. Then we have some other events. So then in 1901, when she was about 15, her mother passed away after giving birth. Then in 1902, they went to Canada, to a foreign country where she didn't really know what was going to happen, right? That can be a life-altering or maybe even traumatic event. In 1905, she was married and she was pregnant at the time that she was married. Not sure if that would have been traumatic or not, but I know that because of her religious background, that was not something that was looked highly upon. Okay, so maybe there was some trauma and some hard things happening there. So now that we have those events that happened to her, those things, those traumatic, life-changing things that happened before my grandfather was born to her, we can think our next question. So how might that have affected them? What negative ways might they have coped, or what positive ways might they have coped? Okay, so we're not always going to have the answers to these. Actually, most of the time we are not going to have the answers unless your ancestor wrote about it, but that's not very likely. So we can think, okay, so she was 5 years old. That's the first event, I guess, that we've come across. She's 5 years old. Her 1-year-old brother dies quite traumatically, being scalded and burned enough that he died. What might that have been like? Okay, she's 5 years old. She's probably at home with her mother as this is happening. Her mother's probably screaming, crying, very emotional. And what would have happened in the days following, right? How would she have been handled? Would she have been pushed to the side? Would she have been comforted? How might she have coped with that? So we can consider those things. And then we can look at, now she has another brother that dies as a baby right the next year after this other brother died. She's 6 years old. Does she remember these things later in life? These are all kind of things that we can ponder and think about when we are considering these traumatic events that happened to our ancestors. Okay. So then after we think about how they might have coped, maybe we have ancestors that we know how they coped. Okay. Maybe we have ancestors that at some point became an alcoholic. Maybe they were abusive. So we can think, okay, what traumatic things happened to them? Could that have caused that behavior later? And then the third question is, do I see any of these coping patterns in myself? Positive or negative? Some of us have ancestors who endured really hard things, but they coped well or positively, or at least maybe seen as positively. Maybe they were very, I see this in some female ancestors, they were very meticulous in how they cared for their family. Maybe that was out of fear. Maybe that was wanting to have control because there's so many variables and unknowns in that time period that people would get sick and die. So they felt they had to keep things clean and very meticulous. That can be seen as positive, but maybe that can, up to a certain point, can be negative, right? Another negative coping, obviously, addiction or abuse. At that time, there was not as much support either. So in the course, we also look at, what kind of support did they have in their life? Did they have friends? Did they have family nearby? And that can affect how they dealt with some of these traumatic things. So for my great grandma, she had these traumatic events that I talked about. She also had some happy and good events. She was a part of one of the first female basketball teams in the area. So we can look at that event. No, it's not traumatic, but it was kind of life altering. How did that affect her? Positively, she had friends. I knew she had support. Could that idea be passed on, right? That we trust people, that we can build friendships. So yes, there's traumatic things that happen. There's also positive things that happen. And why do we want to know these things? Why do we want to know our generational trauma or our generational inheritance from our ancestors? How can that help us now? I think that sometimes people feel like maybe this is an excuse, that maybe people use the stories of their ancestors, how hard things were for them, and how we are still suffering because of that as an excuse to not change. And I hope that we don't do that because that doesn't help anyone. But I think understanding these things helps us recognize that we're not alone. Sometimes we might have beliefs, tendencies, fears that seem to be from nowhere from our own lives. Maybe we are afraid of things that just don't make sense, and it's to a debilitating amount. So when we can look at maybe it came from our ancestors, maybe that fear has been passed down. When we recognize it, when we understand it, we can change it. And we can change so that we can help the following generations to improve and change. So I was reading through this other study, this article from 2023, and it talks about that study that they did with rats with the electric shock and the scent. Okay. Now, this was passed down, I think it was 3 generations. It affected up to the 3rd generation. So like the grandfather rat was exposed to the shock and the scent, and their grandchild rat also had that fear to the scent, even though he had never been shocked. They even like took the rat out of the environment with his parents. Like he was not raised by those rats that were fearful of the scent. So it was a controlled experiment, right? We can't do that with humans, but we could do that with the rats. And so it's still, they still had that fear. But I thought it was interesting that it says the authors later showed that the effects of traumatic experience can be reversed by retraining, specifically by positive conditioning in a safe environment. It says mice exposed to a particular signal without any negative conditioning gradually became desensitized to the odor. They also lost the epigenetic modifications associated with the experience, and the above mentioned physiological changes in the brain likewise disappeared. Okay, so these same rats that they actually found the part in their genes that in their DNA that had been altered, okay, that were more receptive to this scent, okay. After they were conditioned and retrained to not be afraid of the scent, that part was changed. Okay, so I think that is hugely important to understand, that just because our ancestors suffered a traumatic event, something that is seen to have been passed down in the family, that there are coping patterns, negative coping patterns that we see in our family, that epigenetic change can be changed. That's what epigenetics is. It's not, our DNA is not changed. It's how it's expressed is changed, but that can be changed again. Okay, so if you're finding some of these patterns and things and you recognize that maybe you are feeling some of these effects from your ancestors, that with an understanding and with help and support and training, you can reverse that. So I think that's a hopeful understanding for people. And I think that as we recognize and understand where those traumas and those experiences started or began, or maybe were perpetuated, that we can understand better to move forward and to change. So I hope that that was not too confusing. I will link the 2 articles that I found. They are very long and filled with scientific information. But if you want to really look deeper at what this means, if you have a science background and maybe, healing our generational trauma seems like a woo-woo thing, you can read through this and see how there actually are studies and things that they're finding, that what happened to our ancestors is affecting us. This is what we go through in my online course. There's a 40-page workbook that we go through and find those things that happened to your ancestors in all aspects of their life, and look at and question and get curious about how those experiences might be affecting you or other family members. So if you want to join the course, you can go to knowyourancestorcourse.com. I've tried to make it an affordable thing for you to embark on. You can either pay in full or I just changed it to a 6-month payment plan, because you do get access to 6 months of monthly Q&As where you can ask me any questions and get help with your specific family. So you can go to knowyourancestorcourse.com to sign up for that. If you have any questions or feedback, or maybe you are recognizing things in your own family tree that might have been passed down from your ancestors, I'd love to hear about it. I'd love to talk to you about it. This is something that my understanding of it is growing, and it's not absolute. So I am open to hearing more from you, and I'd love to talk to you about that. You can dive into this on your own too, like looking at your ancestors, what you already know about them. You can start asking those questions, what happened to them before my ancestral line was born, and how it's affecting me today. But if you want help looking for those records that tell that story and knowing where to look for them, I can help you with that in the online course. So thanks for listening today, or thanks for watching on YouTube, and we'll see you next time. So I just wanted to remind you that my online course, Know Your Ancestor, that I talk about in this episode, is on sale until June 12th. That's Wednesday next week at midnight. So go take advantage of that, get the online course so you can really dive in and look at your own possible generational trauma, how you can, discover those stories and that information about your ancestors. I show you how to do that step by step, and really help you to ask those questions and help you to ponder how your ancestors' life might be affecting you and your family. So go get that at knowyourancestorcourse.com, and it's on sale until June 12th at midnight.